Welcome to the channel. We're so glad you're here. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to click like and subscribe to stay updated with our latest content. Your support helps us create more awesome videos for you. Let us know what you think in the comments below. Enjoy the video. The unblinking gaze. It was well past the witching hour, and Julian found himself utterly alone on a desolate, unsealed byway that snaked through the rural expanse. The twin beams of his aging sedan were the sole illumination, slicing through a darkness that seemed to press in from the expansive, shadowy fields flanking the road. The celestial canvas above was devoid of stars, obscured by an oppressive blanket of clouds. Hours of monotonous driving had taken their toll, and a bone-deep weariness had settled upon him. Feeling the vehicle decelerate, a growing sense of unease solidified into a cold dread as he recognized the silhouette's undeniable human-like configuration. Reacting on pure instinct, Julian wrenched the steering wheel sharply to the left. He felt the car's rear tires momentarily lose traction on the loose gravel surface, a momentary skid that sent a shiver of panic through him. He managed to avoid colliding with the figure, but the abrupt maneuver cost him control for a terrifying few heartbeats. The car spun partially, ending up angled across the roadway, headlights now illuminating the emptiness of the adjacent field. The engine, thankfully, continued to run. Julian exhaled a shaky breath, his body trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline. The figure was now behind him. He was acutely aware of the location. A desperate urge to check the rearview mirror warred with a more immediate need to assess the front of his vehicle. There had been a scraping sound during the near collision, and Julian was unwilling to trust that his car had escaped unscathed. The prospect of opening the hood in the inky blackness was deeply unappealing, but he felt compelled to verify what he had glimpsed, to confirm the reality of the roadside encounter. He engaged the parking brake and cautiously exited the vehicle. The night air was surprisingly frigid, carrying the damp, earthy scent of the surrounding fields. Revealed a desolate landscape, barren dirt, sparsely scattered bushes, and a dilapidated fence in the far distance. Julian turned. He instinctively raised a hand to shield his eyes from his car's headlamps, but the figure remained shrouded in the obscurity of the unlit field. He could only perceive its outline, which now appeared taller, no longer crouched. It stood motionless, radiating an unsettling stillness. Julian cautiously approached the hood of his car, his movements deliberate and hesitant. He unlatched it, the metallic click echoing unnaturally loud in the stillness, and propped it open. From the glove compartment, he retrieved a small but powerful LED flashlight. He leaned over the engine bay, directing the beam onto the radiator, hoses, and belts. His ears strained, listening to the engine's idle. It was rough, a slightly uneven rhythm, but not alarmingly so. Nothing appeared to be severely damaged, at least not visibly. He needed a moment, a brief respite to collect himself, to quell the frantic hammering of his heart. His breathing was shallow and rapid, and he could feel the clammy dampness of perspiration on his neck, despite the chill night air. He consciously forced himself to inhale deeply to slow his respiratory rate. He glanced repeatedly over his shoulder, a nervous tick born of mounting apprehension. Each time he averted his gaze and then looked back, the figure seemed to have subtly shifted position, closer, but imperceptibly so. Initially, it had stood at a distance of at least 30 yards. Now, after a few fleeting glances, it appeared to be no more than 20 yards away. Then, even closer. The movement was unsettling, not a conventional walk. It was as if the figure only translocated when unobserved. Julian never witnessed it actually taking a step. It simply occupied a new position each time he turned his head back. With a frustrated slam, Julian closed the hood, the sound jarring in the otherwise silent night. He backed away until he felt the reassuring solidity of the car door against his back. He kept his gaze locked on the figure, his hand reaching for the door handle. His fingers trembled as he pulled the door open. The urge to flee was overwhelming, but he had to turn his head to get inside the vehicle. As he did, a subtle shift in the figure's posture registered in the corner of his eye. Once inside, Julian slammed the door shut and engaged the locks. A futile gesture, perhaps. Julian could now discern more. The figure possessed a humanoid outline, but the clothing was indistinct, appearing loose and shapeless. The face remained obscured, but he could make out pale skin where the eyes reflected the light. The eyes themselves remained unblinking. The body was unnervingly thin, the arms hanging limply at its sides. The knees were bent slightly inward, lending the figure an awkward, unnatural stance. It was now only about 10 yards away. Julian could observe the rise and fall of its chest, shallow, rapid breaths. He strained to hear any sound emanating from the figure, but there was nothing, only the visual evidence of respiration. "Hey!" Julian yelled, his voice cracking slightly. A renewed wave of panic surged through him. He realized that a rear tire must be caught, perhaps on a rock or snagged in the uneven terrain. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. His legs felt strangely weak, his arms heavy. He pressed the gas pedal again, harder this time. The engine revved, a strained whine. The car shuddered violently, but remained stubbornly immobile. He clenched his teeth, a grimace of frustration contorting his face, sweat beading on his forehead. The figure was right there, an unnerving proximity that amplified his fear. He could now see one of its hands, a skeletal hand with elongated fingers that twitched subtly. It remained completely silent, no footfalls, no breathing, nothing to betray its presence save for its unnerving visual manifestation. Julian left the headlights and engine running. He leaned across to the passenger side and opened the glove compartment, retrieving a small toolbox. Inside, he found a flashlight, some spare fuses, and a folding knife, meager tools against the unknown. He grabbed the knife, his fingers fumbling slightly, and placed it in his pocket. A cold, hard knot of dread settled in his stomach. He had no plan, no clear course of action. If he remained in the car, he was trapped, a sitting duck. If he exited to inspect the tires, he would have to break his gaze with the figure, and every time he did that, it inexorably drew closer. A desperate thought surfaced. Perhaps he could reverse further, gain enough momentum to turn the car around. He shifted into reverse, his neck muscles screaming in protest as he craned his head to look behind him, trying to avoid looking away from the figure for more than a split second. He pressed the gas pedal. The car jerked backward slightly, then he felt a distinct bump. He whipped his head forward. The figure was now leaning against his driver's side window, its unnaturally bright eyes reflecting the interior light of the car. Its mouth was now slightly agape, revealing thin, cracked lips. He could see its nostrils flare, as if it were sampling the air, assessing his scent. Primal scream tore from Julian's throat. He instinctively recoiled, letting go of the steering wheel for a fleeting moment. His chest constricted, a vice-like pressure making it difficult to breathe. He scrambled for the tire iron, his hand shaking uncontrollably as he raised it in a defensive posture. The figure pressed a hand against the glass, the palm splayed flat against the window. The fingers were impossibly long and thin, each terminating in a dull, white fingernail. He could see the texture of its skin, a grotesque tapestry of rough, dry patches. "Get away!" Julian yelled, his voice a strangled cry. He banged the tire iron against the inside of the glass, a futile gesture of defiance. The figure didn't even flinch. It simply watched him, its gaze unwavering, its eyes reflecting the interior light with that unsettling, unnatural brightness. He turned the wheel sharply and then, with a surge of adrenaline, slammed the car into drive, jerking over the uneven terrain. The car lurched forward, finally free. He straightened the wheel, keeping the figure in his line of sight. It began to follow, walking at a steady, unhurried pace. He now had about 20 yards between them. The tension in his neck and shoulders was excruciating. The figure continued its pursuit, but it never ran, maintaining that unsettling, steady walk. He gradually increased his speed, the figure receding into a dark shape in his rearview mirror. He eased the car onto a slightly smoother patch of road, his headlights illuminating a bend ahead. He glanced back in the rearview mirror. The figure was farther away now, barely visible. He wondered if it would continue its pursuit indefinitely. He was still trembling, his hands clammy on the steering wheel, his stomach twisted into a tight knot. He tried to focus on escape, to banish the unsettling image from his mind. He continued driving for several minutes. The figure gradually diminished in size, eventually disappearing from view. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to regain some semblance of composure. His heart still hammered, his mouth felt parched. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with his sleeve. The road straightened, and in the distance, he saw a faint glow, the possible indication of a main road or a distant farmhouse. He focused on reaching that beacon of hope. The car, despite its ordeal, seemed to be functioning adequately, aside from some minor steering wobble. He suspected the ditch hadn't inflicted any catastrophic damage. He continued checking the mirrors, his gaze darting back and forth. He saw no movement behind him. He didn't want to leave the car again, not to check for damage, not to turn around, not to stop. He was driven by a primal urge to keep moving, to reach a populated area, a gas station, anything that offered safety and the presence of other humans. His mind, however, remained fixated on the figure. He tried to push it away, to suppress the image, but it lingered. The tension remained, a palpable weight in his neck and shoulders. His leg muscles ached from the constant pressure on the pedals. He turned on the radio, a desperate attempt at distraction, but only static greeted him. He switched it off. After approximately 10 more minutes, he saw a paved road crossing ahead. It was narrow, but it was paved. Rolled down his window a crack and listened. He heard the distant hum of traffic, possibly from a larger highway. That was all he needed. He continued, relentlessly closing the distance whenever he looked away. The memory of its face, particularly those unnaturally reflective eyes, was seared into his mind. He tried to banish the image, focusing solely on reaching safety. He drove for at least another hour, taking turns that led him toward increasingly familiar signs. Eventually, he reached a main highway. The hum of the tires on the smooth asphalt was a welcome sound, a balm to his frayed nerves. He glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The darkness was empty. He took another deep breath, trying to release the pent-up tension in his back. The night was still quiet, but it felt normal now, devoid of that unnerving presence. There were no strange, glowing eyes in the distance, just the empty road and the long drive ahead. He heard the rain begin to patter against his windshield around 2 a.m. He was sitting in his darkened living room, curtains partially closed, mindlessly scrolling through his phone. The apartment was silent. He had turned off the TV earlier, finding nothing of interest. His place was small. A living room connected to a short hallway, a kitchen to the left, a bedroom at the end. The front door led to a tiny, covered porch with a single light fixture above it. He distinctly remembered checking that porch light before settling down. It had been functioning perfectly. He also had a small security camera mounted above the door, facing the driveway and the porch steps. It was configured to send an alert to his phone if it detected motion. Not a high-end system, but sufficient for basic security. That night, the rain intensified, heavier than usual. He could hear the water cascading off the roof and splashing onto the concrete below. His curtains were thin, and even though they were partially closed, he could discern faint shapes outside whenever headlights passed on the street. It happened a couple of times, cars rolling by, their beams briefly illuminating the walls of his living room. He paid little attention, his mind adrift. Then he noticed something unsettling. There was a shape outside on the porch. He saw it through the thin fabric of the curtains, a dark outline that resembled a person, standing completely motionless. It felt wrong because he hadn't heard anyone approach. He had been listening to the rain, and he hadn't heard footsteps or the creak of the porch boards. His front door was cheap, prone to rattling if any weight was placed on the deck. yet he hadn't heard a thing. Still, his heart began to beat faster, a subtle tremor in his chest. The back of his neck felt strangely cold. He slowly rose from the couch, moving deliberately, trying to make as little noise as possible. He didn't want whoever it was to know he was there, although perhaps they already did. Perhaps they had seen the glow of his phone screen. He moved closer to the window. The figure remained motionless. It appeared to be a person wearing a hood, something obscuring their head. He couldn't make out any details, just a tall, static form. He moved to the side, reaching for his phone. There were no alerts from the security camera app. This unsettled him further. If there was a person out there, why hadn't the camera detected them? He opened the app. The camera was online. The last recorded clip showed only rainfall, no figure. He tapped on the live view. The screen displayed the porch, the driveway, the reflection of the streetlight on the wet pavement, nothing else. No person, no shape, just empty space. He peered back at the curtain. He still saw the shape, but on his phone screen, there was no one. He began to feel lightheaded, a disorienting sensation. He closed the app and walked slowly to the door. The door had a small peephole. He took a deep breath. He pressed his eye against it, expecting to see a face staring back. The porch was empty. He scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement, a shadow, anything out of place. He saw the wet porch floor, rain blowing in and forming a small puddle in one corner. The porch light was on, illuminating the emptiness. There was no one out there. He stepped back, glancing at the curtain again. The shape was gone. He lifted the curtain and looked outside. The porch was empty, just as it had appeared on the camera feed. The street beyond was quiet, the sidewalk glistening with rain. There were no footprints visible from his vantage point, not that he expected to see any from that angle. He unlocked the door and opened it, letting a gust of rain-laden wind blow in. His socks got damp as he stepped onto the porch. He looked left, then right. Nothing, just rain and empty streets. The nearest house had its lights off, his movements deliberate and cautious. He retrieved his phone and tried to think rationally. Maybe it was just his imagination, a trick of the light and the rain. But he was sure he had seen someone. The sound of the rain was too loud, a constant drumming against the roof and windows. His mind kept replaying that image of a shape, a solid figure standing motionless on his porch. He hadn't imagined it. It had been there. He got up and checked the front window again. He parted the curtains and looked outside. The porch light shone on empty space. The street was still deserted. No cars, no people, just the relentless rain. He paced around the living room, feeling a growing sense of frustration. He didn't know what to do. Calling the police would be pointless, even embarrassing. There was no one there. There was no damage, no sign of forced entry, no tangible reason to believe a crime was in progress. He tried to think logically. Maybe someone had stepped up to the porch, stood there for a moment, and then left. Maybe the camera had malfunctioned, a temporary glitch. Maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Nothing moved outside. Eventually, he set his coffee down and decided to check the camera feed again. He tapped the app icon. The live feed looked normal. Empty porch, empty driveway, the neighbor's house across the street. Nothing unusual. He scrolled through the motion clips once more. Mostly just rain triggers. A car passing by an hour ago. That was it. Umbrella in hand. That confirmed the camera was functioning correctly now. So why had it missed the figure earlier? He went back inside and locked the door. He felt a little better, having thoroughly checked the perimeter. Maybe it had been a prank, someone running up to the porch and standing there briefly, hoping for a reaction. But why would they leave no trace? And how had they vanished so quickly? He decided to try to pass the time until morning. He sat in front of the TV, keeping the volume low, and listened for any sound from outside. The rain never slowed. It kept going, steady and heavy. Eventually, around 4 a.m., he checked the porch again. Nothing. He felt tired enough to attempt sleep again. He turned off the TV, but this time he left the living room light on. He went to bed, lay down, and tried to ignore the persistent drumming of the rain. His heart rate was closer to normal now, his breathing steady. He felt calmer, although a residue of unease remained. Maybe he had imagined the whole thing. He tried to reconstruct the exact moment he had seen the figure. It was just a shape, no details.
No color.
Perhaps it had been a shadow, a fleeting illusion created by a passing car's headlights. He had seen lights wash over the curtains before. Maybe some object outside had cast a strange silhouette. He drifted off to sleep for a while. When he woke up, it was early morning. The rain had stopped. The room was quiet. He got up and checked the porch again. It was just wet, nothing else. He stepped outside with some paper towels and dried up the puddle. The air was crisp and smelled fresh. The street looked normal. A few neighbors were leaving for work. He nodded at one of them. The neighbor didn't mention anything unusual, and he didn't bring it up. He checked the camera feed again. In the daylight, it had recorded him stepping out with the umbrella, drying the puddle, the neighbor walking by. Everything was working perfectly now. He scrolled back to the time he had seen the figure. Nothing, just rain. He never found any explanation. He checked for loose boards or anything that might resemble a person's shape in the dark. He found nothing that matched what he had seen. He thought about the camera's sensitivity, the possibility of a glitch, a blind spot. But the porch was small. There weren't many places where a figure could stand and remain completely undetected. He decided to move on with his day. He had breakfast, changed clothes, and tried not to dwell on the incident. But every time he looked at that porch, he remembered the shape. It had been a solid, still figure, not moving, not reacting. When he had checked through the peephole, it was gone. The camera hadn't seen it, only him. That's all he knew. He couldn't explain it. All he had was that memory. A shape standing quietly in the rain and then vanishing without a trace. He never got an answer, and nothing like that ever happened again. At least, not yet. He dismissed it as an animal outside, but it didn't possess the typical characteristics of animal vocalizations. It sounded distinctly human, like someone crying. The sound was muffled, filtered through the walls, but he could discern the unmistakable pattern of sobbing, punctuated by pauses, as if the person were attempting to stifle their grief. Ethan rose from bed and approached the window. He looked out towards the house next door, the one with the closed shutters. All the lights were off. There were no vehicles parked outside. He couldn't see any movement. He carefully opened his window a fraction of an inch and listened intently. The crying continued, a mournful sound that persisted for approximately 10 minutes, then abruptly ceased. The following morning, Ethan decided to engage with his neighbors. He knocked on the door across the street, introducing himself to a man named Arthur, who appeared to be in his 50s. Arthur was dressed in a plain gray t-shirt and jeans, his hair cropped short, his expression rather impassive. "Hi, I'm Ethan," he began. "I just moved in next door. I was wondering about the house beside mine." He gestured towards the house with the closed shutters. Arthur glanced at the house, then back at Ethan. "That place is vacant," he stated flatly. "Has been for years." Ethan frowned. "Last night, I heard someone crying," he explained. "I'm pretty sure it was coming from inside that house." Arthur shrugged, his demeanor suggesting a lack of interest. "Nobody's lived there. The owner moved out a long time ago. You must have heard something else. Maybe a cat." He didn't seem inclined to continue the conversation, offering a curt nod before closing his door. Later that day, Ethan spoke to another neighbor down the street, a woman named Sarah. Sarah's reaction was similar to Arthur's. Confusion. She reiterated that the house had been empty for a considerable length of time, perhaps 8 years or so. She didn't know the reason for its vacancy and claimed she had never heard anything unusual. Ethan spent the remainder of the afternoon unpacking, arranging his living room, setting up his television on a small stand, and trying to find a suitable placement for his worn-out couch. He organized his kitchen, stocking the refrigerator with basic groceries. By evening, he felt sufficiently settled in. He didn't fully believe his neighbors. He trusted his own hearing. It had been a human cry, unmistakably. He resolved to stay up again that night and listen. Around midnight, he turned off all the lights and sat near the window that faced the neighboring house. At approximately 12:20 a.m., he heard it again. The crying began softly, then gradually increased in volume. It was muffled, but he was certain it originated from within the house. The sound was too consistent, too inherently human. He pressed his ear against the wall, almost feeling the subtle vibrations. He turned off the air conditioning unit to eliminate any extraneous noise. The crying continued for at least 10 minutes, then faded away. A knot of unease tightened in his stomach. This didn't feel right. He considered calling the authorities, perhaps the police, but he had no concrete evidence of anything. Reporting cries heard from a supposedly empty house at midnight seemed absurd, even to him. Still, the feeling of uncertainty, of not knowing, gnawed at him. He tested the front doorknob. It was locked, as expected. He tried to peek through the mail slot, but it was blocked by something on the inside. The house was utterly silent. There was no sound of movement, no indication of any presence within. He knocked on the door, a light, tentative rap. No response. He felt a growing awkwardness standing there, so he retreated and returned home. Around 3 p.m., he decided to approach another set of neighbors, an older couple, George and Martha, who lived to his right. They were outside in their driveway, cleaning out their car. He introduced himself and inquired about the house once more. George straightened up and told him the same story. The house had been empty since before they had moved in, which was approximately 5 years prior. He said it belonged to a man named Mr. Henderson, who had simply left one day and never returned. The place remained locked, and nobody bothered with it. But he was consumed by this mystery. He needed to know what was happening. If someone was injured or trapped, they needed help. If it was an intruder, he needed to know that too. He had no intention of stealing anything. He simply needed answers. The following day, he spent some time casing the perimeter of the empty house. He walked around the block, checking for any other possible points of entry into the backyard. He noticed a side gate on the opposite side of the property, but it was secured with a padlock. Crouching low to avoid being silhouetted against the night sky, the house remained dark and silent. He waited for the crying. Right on schedule, it started. The sound emanated from the ground floor, dilapidated shelves. He squeezed through the window, landing on the floor, careful to avoid scraping his legs on the jagged frame. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and mildew. He stood still, listening. The crying was clearly above him. He searched for stairs. He found a wooden staircase leading up. Each step creaked ominously under his weight. He moved slowly, shining the flashlight ahead of him. At the top of the stairs, there was a door. He turned the knob. It wasn't locked. He opened it carefully and entered what appeared to be a kitchen. There was an ancient refrigerator, cabinets with peeling paint, and a table covered in a thick layer of dust. The air inside was cold, causing goosebumps to rise on his arms. The crying was coming from a room to his left. He moved towards it slowly, his heart pounding a frantic tattoo against his ribs. He shined his flashlight ahead. The living room contained old furniture draped with sheets, a sofa, 2 armchairs, and a coffee table. In the corner, he saw movement. A figure sat on the floor, their back against the wall. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Ethan could feel the tension radiating from her, a palpable wave of fear. He decided not to press the issue. He turned and walked back towards the kitchen, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He located the basement door and climbed out the same way he had entered. Outside, the night air felt cleaner, trading precious daylight hours of sleep for the cold comfort of a slightly fatter paycheck. About 2 weeks into this nocturnal routine, on a rare occasion when the sun's rays dared to penetrate the darkness between 3:30 and 4 a.m., a sudden, jarring noise ripped me from my slumber. My apartment, you see, is a basement suite, a subterranean dwelling where the windows are practically level with the sidewalk. The walls are thin, almost comically so, acting more like sound amplifiers than barriers. Half asleep, My mind groped for an explanation. A clumsy neighbor? Perhaps something heavy dropped in the unit above? I dismissed the sound, burying myself back under the covers, willing sleep to reclaim me. 10 minutes ticked by, each one an eternity in the silent darkness. My eyes remained closed, but my ears strained, anticipating a repetition. And it came. This time, there was no mistaking it. A deliberate, insistent knocking. Not on the door, but on the window. Panic clawed at my throat. I'm a young woman, living alone. The implications of a late-night window knocker in a basement apartment were terrifyingly clear. Every instinct screamed at me to remain silent, to play dead, and his fondness for perching on the windowsill. I had forgotten to close and lock the window properly. It was almost entirely open. Anxiety, already a simmering pot, boiled over. My hands trembled uncontrollably as I fumbled for my phone, the lifeline to the outside world, to the police. But my clumsiness, amplified by fear, betrayed me. The phone slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the floor. The sound from outside shifted. No longer a knock, but a slow, deliberate scraping, like fingernails or something sharper, being dragged down the mesh of the window screen. The intruder, whoever they were, was either attempting to gain entry or, perhaps even more disturbingly, simply trying to terrify me. Driven by a surge of reckless courage, fueled by pure desperation, I ran towards the window. I slammed it shut, the sound echoing in the small room, and twisted the lock, all while desperately avoiding looking outside, avoiding making eye contact with whatever lurked in the shadows. The knocking ceased. Silence descended, heavy and absolute. I waited, heart pounding, for what felt like an eternity. The rocks I'd placed around the tense perimeter, meant to anchor it against the wind, were also missing. A prickle of alarm ran down my spine. I hadn't encountered a single soul on my drive up, and the utter absence of any other campers solidified my growing suspicion. Something was amiss. The wilderness, usually alive with subtle sounds, was eerily silent. Cell service was non-existent this far back, a couple of miles into the wild. Frustrated and increasingly anxious, I reversed course, driving back towards civilization until I could regain a signal. I contacted my friends, relaying the unsettling discovery. They, fueled by weeks of anticipation for this trip, urged me to stay, to at least enjoy a few hours of camaraderie. Once the group had assembled, my unease hadn't subsided. I decided to conduct a brief search of the surrounding area, hoping to find some clue, some trace of the individuals who had pilfered my belongings. Footprints, discarded items, anything. As expected, my search proved fruitless. I attempted to shrug it off, determined not to spoil the evening for everyone. I would resume the search in the morning, I reasoned, and contact the Forest Service to report the theft. In retrospect, this was a catastrophic misjudgment. As the night deepened, the atmosphere seemed convivial. Around 1 or 2 in the morning, most of my friends decided to retire for the night. I, having no tent, opted to sleep in my truck, a decision that, in hindsight, proved to be one of the few wise choices I made that night. That, and the ever-present bear spray and my legally owned sidearm. A rustling just beyond our campsite. It was enough to jolt me awake. I froze, every muscle tense, listening intently. The sound was substantial, not the scuttling of a raccoon or any other small creature. This was something larger. Paralyzed with fear, I focused on the sounds emanating from outside. My immediate thought, a bear. Recent sightings in the area had been reported. The silence of the wilderness, usually punctuated by the chirping of insects or the calls of nocturnal birds, was complete and absolute. This, I knew, was never a positive sign in the wild. It often indicated the presence of a large predator. The fire had long since died down, casting the campsite in impenetrable darkness. 15 minutes passed without any further sound. I began to berate myself for my paranoia, preparing to drift back to sleep. Then I saw it. To the right of our campsite, mere yards from the extinguished fire pit and perhaps 20 yards from my position in the truck, stood a figure. Person, But this was no ordinary person. It was the dead of night, deep in the wilderness, and this individual was lurking in someone else's campsite. Adding to the horror, they were wearing what I could only describe as a mask. My heart hammered against my ribs. Always carry protection. Inform others of your plans. And never, ever go alone. There are hundreds of missing person reports across the national parks of the United States, and I could have easily become another statistic. Nature attracts all kinds, those seeking adventure and those seeking to remain unseen, lurking in the shadows. A former Green Beret once imparted this wisdom. Survival hinges on awareness and trusting your instincts. If a situation feels wrong, it probably is. Stay safe. The trails whisper. The air was crisp and still that morning, devoid of any breeze. Daniel adjusted the strap of his small water bottle. His running shoes laced tightly. The dirt path of the Miller's Creek Trail stretched before him, lined with overgrown weeds and brush. It was supposed to be a short run, a couple of miles at most. He aimed to be back home before the midday heat became oppressive. There were no other people around. He hadn't seen any parked cars near the trailhead, and he hadn't encountered anyone during the initial stretch of his run. This was typical for Miller's Creek. It was a relatively secluded trail, rarely crowded. He started at a moderate pace, focusing on warming up his muscles. He concentrated on his breathing, listening to the rhythmic crunch of gravel beneath his worn-out running shoes. He tried to maintain his gaze forward, avoiding distractions. The tall grass lining both sides of the trail swayed gently on occasion, when a stray breeze managed to penetrate the stillness, but that day it remained remarkably motionless. He noticed small flies buzzing around and heard the distant chirping of birds. Otherwise, it was a scene of quiet solitude. After about 10 minutes, his legs felt looser, more limber. He increased his pace slightly. His shoes were old, the soles thin, and he could feel every pebble and uneven patch of ground beneath his feet. His calves felt a bit tight. He was sweating lightly. His throat constricted. He swallowed, trying to regain control. "Who's there?" he asked, his voice strained. No answer. Just the whisper again, his name, and the faint, almost imperceptible sound of breathing, as if someone were exhaling close to his ear. He stepped towards the grass, reached in, and pushed it aside again. His fingers brushed against the dry blades. He saw dirt, small patches of weeds, a few scattered rocks. He even kicked at the base of the grass, hoping to dislodge something. Anything. Nothing. He backed away, scanning the trail. There were no footprints other than his own. He saw his own shoe prints clearly imprinted in the dirt. The air remained still. He heard no cars, no human voices, nothing but the whisper. And the whisper was coming from the grass. He tried walking slowly forward along the trail, keeping his eyes fixed on the grass line. The whisper followed him. It didn't cease. It didn't fade. It called his name repeatedly. He tried speaking to it, demanding, "What do you want?" He received nothing in return, except his name, whispered again and again. He began to feel the hairs on his arms prickle. His neck felt stiff. His stomach clenched into a tight knot. He felt exposed, vulnerable. He could smell his own sweat. After perhaps half a mile of this agonizing pursuit, he stopped again. He couldn't continue running like this. He turned towards the grass, his voice strained with a mixture of fear and frustration. "I don't know who you are," he said. "Show yourself." He waited. The whisper responded, softly uttering his name again. His pulse was racing, his legs felt heavy, his chest tight. He reached for his phone, the thought of calling someone flashing through his mind. But he hesitated. Who would he call? The police? What would he tell them? That he was being followed by a whisper in the grass? They would think he was delusional or playing a prank. Besides, there was no signal out here. The reception on this trail was notoriously unreliable. He stepped closer to the grass, kneeling down, and carefully parted the tall stalks. He was searching for any movement, any sign of a person concealed within. He saw only dirt, a few crawling insects, the earthy scent of the soil, and some small plants with tiny leaves. There was no hidden figure. The whisper didn't seem to emanate from a specific point. It felt pervasive, all around the left side of the trail. He stood up and backed away, feeling a growing sense of unease. His face felt hot, and he noticed his mouth was still parched. He took another sip of water, trying not to spill any, as his hand was shaking slightly. He tried walking again, slowly, keeping his eyes fixed on the grass. The whisper matched his pace. Whenever he stopped, it continued, always at that same soft volume, always his name, repeated over and over. He tried a different tactic. He walked to the other side of the trail, putting the width of the path between himself and the grass. The whisper grew quieter, but it didn't cease entirely. He approached the middle of the path, and it became slightly louder again. It always seemed loudest when he was closest to the left side. He took a step towards the left side. The whisper intensified, but it still remained frustratingly indistinct, offering no other words, only his name. It sounded like a man's voice, low and steady, not frantic or hurried. It sounded oddly calm, which made it even more unnerving. He would have preferred shouting, screaming, something that conveyed a recognizable emotion. This calm, steady whisper felt unnatural, unsettling. He tried to devise a way to escape it. The trail ahead curved slightly, leading deeper into the scrubland. The grass didn't appear to be any shorter up ahead. If he continued, he would have another mile or two before reaching a side path that led back to a main road. But that meant staying within earshot of this disembodied voice. He considered turning back, retracing his steps, but that would mean running the entire distance back to the trailhead, and he wasn't sure if the whisper would follow him. Maybe it would. Maybe it would never stop. He decided to keep moving forward. He picked up his pace, trying to keep his eyes straight ahead, focusing on the end of the straight section of the trail, watching the pebbles and dirt under his feet. He could feel sweat running down his back. The whisper continued, steady, calm, repeating his name. He felt his muscles tense. He tried to block it out, but he couldn't. It was too close, too strange. As he approached a slight bend in the trail, he noticed the grass thinning a little. There were some patches of shorter grass. He moved forward, hope flickering within him, thinking that if he reached an area where the vegetation was less dense, perhaps the voice would cease. He ran, breathing hard, his heart pounding. The whisper stayed with him. It didn't fade. It just kept going. When he reached the thinner grass, he slowed down and checked the sides again. The whisper was still there. It didn't matter that the grass was shorter. He looked around desperately, trying to catch a glimpse of anything that could explain the phenomenon. He saw empty fields, a few scattered shrubs, dry soil, and some distant trees. He saw nothing that could account for the whisper. He clenched his jaw, trying to ignore the trembling in his hands. He remembered he had a small pocket knife in his shorts pocket, a cheap folding knife he sometimes carried. He pulled it out and flipped it open. It made him feel a fraction more secure, although he had no idea who or what he would use it against. He held it down by his side and stared at the grass. "Stop," he said, his voice firm, but not loud. "Just stop." The whisper didn't stop. Said his name again, slower this time. He felt a drop of sweat fall from his chin. He wanted to leave this place, to get away from this unsettling presence. He decided to keep moving forward, to run until he reached the main road. He knew he would feel safer once he reached a place where cars might pass by. He started jogging again, faster this time. He let his legs work, trying to ignore the dryness in his throat, the stiffness in his shoulders and neck. The whisper matched his speed. It stayed with him for the next 10 minutes. Every time he glanced at the grass, it looked normal. Nothing moved, nothing stood out. The voice never changed. It never became angry or louder than a whisper. It never said anything other than his name. But it never let him go. He kept running, his lungs burning, his feet aching. He just focused on putting one foot in front of the other. The whisper followed. It never fell behind. He tried saying things to it. "Leave me alone," he said. "I don't know what you want. Just go away." None of it mattered. his name repeated over and over, never stopping. Finally, he saw the trail junction ahead. There was a small wooden post marking the way towards the main road. A wave of relief washed over him. He turned onto that side trail. The grass there was shorter. There were more rocks. The ground was harder. The whisper continued at first, but then he noticed it starting to fade. He realized after a minute that it was growing quieter. He looked back at the main trail, still seeing the tall grass, still feeling uneasy. He waited, listening. The whisper got softer as he moved away. After about 30 more steps, he realized he could barely hear it. After another 30 steps, it was gone. He stopped and took several deep breaths, his chest heaving. He listened carefully. He heard nothing but his own breathing and the distant hum of insects. No voice. He didn't celebrate. He just stood there, shaking slightly, trying to regain his composure. He looked down at his legs. They were dirty with dust and bits of dry grass. His shoes were filthy. His phone band was soaked with sweat. He felt a throbbing headache coming on. He put his knife back in his pocket, took a sip of his remaining water, and started walking towards the main road. He kept his eyes on the ground. He didn't want to look back. He didn't understand what had happened, and he didn't want to think about it. When he reached the main road, about 15 minutes later, he saw a car drive by. He sighed, feeling a measure of safety return. He checked his phone and, miraculously, got a weak signal. He opened it and saw the time. It had only been about 40 minutes since he had started his run. Felt like hours. He walked along the roadside until he reached the small parking area where he had left his car. His car was still there, untouched. He got in, locked the doors, and turned on the engine. He drove away without looking back at the trail. For the rest of that day, he tried not to think about what he had heard. The whisper was too strange, too inexplicable to make sense of. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't know how to explain it. He didn't return to that trail. He took a different route the next time he went running. He still feels uneasy when he thinks about that voice, whispering his name from the grass, following him, never revealing itself, never changing its tone. Even now, he can remember exactly how it sounded, how dry the air felt, how quiet everything else was. He can still feel that sweat running down his back and the tension knotting his stomach. He has no explanation for it. He's just glad he got out of there. He has no plans to go back and find out what was in that grass. The unseen observer. It began subtly, during a brief pause on a remote hiking trail. It was late afternoon, and there were 4 of them: Daniel, Peter, Mark, and Louise. They had chosen to explore a secluded park, far from any towns or cities, drawn by the promise of quiet trails and unspoiled scenery. The trees were tall and dense, their dry leaves rustling with every passing breeze. It felt like a place untouched by frequent human presence. Daniel, leaning forward with his hands resting on his knees, catching his breath. Daniel strained his ears, listening for any distant hum or buzzing that might betray a mechanical origin. He heard nothing, only his own labored breathing and the crunch of dirt under Mark's boots as he shifted his weight. Wiping the sweat from his forehead, Daniel pointed out the anomaly to the others. Peter squinted, his brow furrowing in concentration. Could it be a reflection? Maybe a plane or a helicopter, far off? Daniel didn't think so. The movement was too peculiar, too erratic. It would dart left, then right, then suddenly ascend higher, remaining still for a moment before shifting position again. It was clearly visible against the clear afternoon sky. They could see its glow whenever it found a gap in the foliage. Louise pulled out her phone, attempting to record the phenomenon. But there was no cellular service in this remote location, and the camera captured only a shaky, indistinct white dot. He cursed under his breath, muttering that it was probably nothing, but his expression betrayed a growing concern. They were all uneasy, felt wrong. They were far from any designated viewpoint or rest area. If it was a drone, it belonged to someone with a reason to be out here observing hikers. That made no sense. They had encountered no one else on the trail all day. They decided to continue their hike. They had planned to make camp near a stream, another few miles ahead. They walked at a steady pace, keeping a watchful eye on the light whenever the opportunity presented itself. It stayed with them, drifting above the treetops on their left side. Sometimes it vanished behind dense branches, leading them to hope it had departed, only to reappear moments later, ahead of them or behind them. It seemed to move with an impossible speed, silently, without any accompanying rustle of equipment or mechanical work. As the sun began to descend, their mood shifted. The light-hearted banter of earlier in the day evaporated, replaced by a heightened alertness. Mark would occasionally tap Daniel's shoulder, pointing out the light whenever it reappeared. Peter, growing increasingly frustrated, tried shouting at it, yelling, "Hey!" into the trees. There was no reaction. The light continued its silent, erratic dance. When it was out of sight, Daniel felt a surge of tension, a knot tightening in his stomach, a dryness in his throat. He kept expecting it to appear from a new, unexpected angle, perhaps directly overhead. They spoke very little, the silence punctuated only by the crunch of their boots and the rustling of their gear. After another hour or so, they reached a small clearing, an area with a few fallen logs and a relatively flat expanse of ground. This was their designated campsite for the night. The stream they had planned to reach was a short walk downhill from this location. The air was growing colder, the sky transitioning through shades of orange and pink. Daniel dropped his backpack, trying to release the tension that had accumulated in his shoulders. His legs ached with fatigue. He took a sip of water, trying to ignore the persistent dryness in his mouth. He scanned the area for the light. It was gone. The others also searched the tree line, their expressions a mixture of relief and lingering apprehension. Peter suggested, hopefully, that it might have been some odd reflection of the setting sun on a metallic object, and now that the sun was descending, it wouldn't reappear. None of them truly believed that explanation. There had been something too controlled, too deliberate about the light's movements. But none of them had a more plausible theory. They set up camp in a subdued atmosphere, the earlier camaraderie replaced by a shared unease. Daniel unrolled his tent, focusing on the mundane tasks. Hammering stakes into the ground, pulling the rainfly over the top, arranging his sleeping bag inside. Louise ignited his portable camp stove and began heating some canned food. Mark continued to scan the treetops, as if anticipating something to drop from the sky. Peter fiddled with his headlamp, adjusting the straps and glancing around nervously. As darkness enveloped them, they switched on their flashlights and headlamps. The forest felt more confined now, the trees seeming to press in closer. The rustling sounds of small animals moving through the undergrowth made Daniel tense. He ate his dinner quietly, the blandness of the food failing to register. He felt no real appetite. He was acutely aware of the darkness, the vastness of the surrounding woods. He looked up at the sky. The stars were incredibly clear, unobscured by any city lights. The view was breathtaking, a tapestry of celestial brilliance, but he kept expecting that bright, white light to reappear. They spoke in low voices, their conversation subdued. Peter suggested maintaining a watch, just to be safe. Daniel didn't object. Something about that light had deeply unsettled them all. They had all experienced the occasional surprises of nature during previous hiking trips, but this felt different, felt directed at them. Daniel volunteered to take the first watch. Mark and Louise agreed to rotate throughout the night. Nobody argued. It seemed the only way to alleviate their collective anxiety. He took the first watch, sitting on a log with his headlamp switched off to conserve the batteries. He held his flashlight in his hand, his senses on high alert. He listened for anything unusual. After about half an hour, he saw it, the same light. It was back, hovering above the treetops on the opposite side of the clearing. A chill ran down his spine, a cold wave that washed over him. He gripped the flashlight tighter, raising it and shining the beam towards the light. It remained there, unreactive, bobbing silently. He walked over to Mark's tent and whispered his name. Mark scrambled out of his sleeping bag, his eyes wide with alarm. He saw the light and froze. He called Peter and Louise. They emerged, still groggy, shining their lights at the mysterious object. They watched it together, a silent, bewildered quartet. Nobody knew what to say. Daniel felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. His heart was beating faster, his breathing shallow. The light dipped behind the treetops, then reappeared on the other side of the clearing, as if it had circled around them. Louise tried yelling again, his voice strained. "Who's there? What do you want?" Nothing. No response. They considered shining a powerful beam directly at it. Mark had a high-intensity flashlight in his pack. He retrieved it, switched it on, and aimed it straight at the light. For a moment, the beam cut through the darkness, illuminating some branches and leaves, but they couldn't discern the source of the light. It was as if it remained just out of reach, concealed behind something. After a few seconds, it vanished again. Mark cursed under his breath. Louise spat on the ground, rubbing his arms as if trying to ward off a chill. They discussed their options in hushed tones. They didn't want to attempt a nighttime escape, risking getting lost in the unfamiliar terrain. They had some hiking experience, but not enough to feel confident navigating in complete darkness with only headlamps and flashlights. They decided to wait until morning. They would pack up and head back down the trail. There was no reason to stay here another night. The tension was too much, the feeling of being watched by something incomprehensible too unnerving. They stood there for a while, shining their flashlights around, hoping to spot the light again. It didn't reappear. After perhaps an hour, exhaustion outweighed their fear. They agreed to return to their tents, taking turns staying awake. Daniel crawled back into his sleeping bag and lay on his back, listening. Sleep was elusive. His mind kept replaying the image of that bright, silent, moving with an unnatural speed and precision. He rubbed his eyes, trying to calm his racing thoughts. Eventually, he dozed off, only to be jolted awake by Mark shaking his shoulder. It was probably around 3 o'clock or 4 a.m. Mark whispered that he had seen the light again, circling the clearing. Daniel got up, rubbed his face, then eventually returned as well. Morning light finally arrived, a welcome relief. Daniel emerged from his tent, his back stiff and sore. He saw Louise boiling water for coffee. He looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed. Peter sat on a log, running a hand through his disheveled hair. Mark was rolling up his sleeping pad. They all shared the same unspoken desire, to leave this place as quickly as possible. Daniel ate a quick energy bar and drank some coffee. It was bitter and not particularly satisfying, but he needed something. They began packing up. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It was quiet, save for their footsteps and the occasional bird call. He tried not to think, to simply count his steps and keep moving forward. Around midday, they stopped near a spot where the trail widened. They checked their maps. They still had a few hours to go before reaching the ranger station where they had parked. They ate some jerky and drank water. His throat felt parched, and he had little appetite, but he forced himself to consume something. Louise kept scanning the trees. Daniel did the same. The sunlight was bright, and he couldn't see anything that resembled the hovering light. He began to wonder if it would reappear in daylight. Part of him hoped it wouldn't. Another part worried about when it would return. They resumed their hike. After another hour or so, Daniel caught a glimpse of something bright off to the side. He stopped abruptly, staring. The others noticed his reaction and stopped as well. The light was back, just above a ridge, flickering in and out of view, as if it were ducking behind branches. He felt his heart rate spike, his every move monitored. His stomach was clenched, his lips dry and tasting of salt. He pulled the straps of his backpack tighter, trying to ignore the unsettling sensation. After a while, it vanished again. They continued walking, each step feeling heavy, the silence between them thick with unspoken apprehension. He noticed Mark's fists were clenched. Peter kept shaking his head quietly, and Louise rubbed the back of his neck, leaving red marks on his skin. Daniel just focused on escaping, on reaching the end of the trail. The hours dragged on. The forest looked the same, but they knew they were getting closer to the ranger station. Eventually, the trees thinned out. They recognized a turn in the trail near a signpost they had seen the previous day. There was a wooden bench and a small trash bin. They were about half an hour from the ranger station. The sunlight was strong, and Daniel could feel it on his neck. He looked back one last time and saw no sign of the light. It had disappeared completely. He felt a surge of relief, but not comfort. He wanted to be inside a building, surrounded by people. They reached the ranger station in the late afternoon. They walked straight to the parking lot where they had left their car. Peter started the engine, and they got in, slamming the doors shut. None of them spoke about what they had seen. He suspected they all just wanted to put it behind them. As they drove away, Daniel felt his body relax slightly, but his mind kept replaying that silent, hovering light, its erratic movements, its unnerving persistence. He wondered if anyone else had ever encountered something similar in that area. They never reported the incident. None of them wanted to deal with the inevitable questions. The skeptical looks on the ranger's face if they tried to explain something they couldn't comprehend. They simply headed home. In the following days, they exchanged text messages, but they avoided any detailed discussion of the event. He believed they were all relieved to have escaped it, but the memory lingered. He still remembers the dryness in his throat, the pounding of his heart, the clammy sweat on his spine when he looked up and saw that thing tracking them through the trees. It's not something he'll easily forget. It's not something he ever wants to encounter again. The unseen occupant. The feeling of unease began almost immediately after Daniel moved into the small, somewhat dilapidated house. It was a Saturday morning, and he was immersed in the chaos of renovations. The place was a mess, littered with debris from pulled-down drywall, discarded boxes, and broken pieces of wood destined for the dumpster outside. He was tired, sweaty, his shoulders aching from the exertion of lifting heavy objects. The plan was straightforward. Rewire the ceiling, run new cables, patch everything up, and apply a fresh coat of paint. The house was small, a single-story structure with a basic attic space, and he possessed a detailed blueprint provided by the previous owners. There were no hidden rooms indicated on the plan, no secret compartments, no unusual architectural features. It was a standard layout. He had inspected the attic during the initial purchase process. Everything had appeared normal. That morning, he climbed up a stepladder in the hallway, having carefully cut away a section of plaster. And that's when he saw it. A door in the ceiling, a flat, wooden door, approximately 2 feet wide and 3 feet long, set flush with the ceiling beams. He froze, staring at it, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with what he knew. That door had not been there before. The attic access was supposed to be in a different area of the house, on the opposite side, with a fold-down ladder, a feature he had used several times already. This new door was something else entirely. It had old, slightly rusted hinges and a simple, curved metal handle, not a modern fixture, but something reminiscent of a bygone era. It looked like a panel someone had painstakingly installed decades ago, but he had never seen it before, and it was conspicuously absent from the blueprints. Confusion warred with a growing sense of apprehension. He ran a hand over the wood of the door, felt rough, textured. The hinges bore a thin coating of rust. The handle was a simple piece of metal, curved outward. It didn't resemble any contemporary hardware. He tried to move it to test if it was locked. It shifted slightly, producing a faint scraping sound against the surrounding beams. He heard nothing else. The attic above him should have been empty, containing only insulation and old wiring. He wondered if he was mistaken, if the blueprint had simply omitted this detail. He decided to open it. He reached up and tugged on the handle. The door, initially resisted, stuck fast, except for his own breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the street outside. There was no movement, no voices, no sounds of animals. But he felt something, a subtle, unsettling sensation, a feeling of not being alone. His neck tingled. He felt a prickling on his arms. It was as if someone, or something was just out of sight watching him. He focused his light in every direction, systematically scanning the space. Nothing moved. He backed his head out and closed the door, the hinges squeaking in protest. He stood on the ladder, staring at the closed panel, his mind racing. He returned to his work, but his concentration was fractured. His tools felt heavier than usual, his back ached, and he kept glancing over his shoulder at that section of the ceiling, the area above the hallway, near the old coat closet. He had never noticed any hatch there before. He completed the wiring and put his tools away in the late afternoon. He ate some lunch, determined to conduct a more thorough inspection. He moved the light slowly, methodically across the beams, the insulation, the corners of the confined space. He noticed some old nails sticking out of the wood, a piece of lumber lying flat across two joists, perhaps a leftover plank from some long-ago project. Nothing else was visible, but the feeling was back, stronger this time. His heart beat faster, his mouth felt dry, his shoulders stiffened with tension. He spoke out loud, just to break the oppressive silence. "Anyone here?" he asked, his voice sounding strangely muffled in the confined space. Obviously, there was no answer. His voice seemed to be swallowed by the attic, absorbed by the insulation and the old wood. He felt a chill, a distinct drop in temperature. He pulled his head back down and shut the door, securing it with a small latch he found on the side. Clicked into place. He climbed down, wiping sweat from his face. He told himself to remain calm. It was just an attic space. He would seal it off later, perhaps tomorrow. Painting the living room, repairing the bathroom sink, sanding the bedroom floor. The house felt different now. He was on edge, acutely aware of every creak and groan of the old structure. He kept imagining he heard faint noises, the subtle shifting of floorboards, a soft tapping sound. Each time he investigated, he found nothing. He looked up at the ceiling frequently, peering inside, a final check to ensure nothing had changed, that he hadn't somehow overlooked something significant. Everything appeared as it had before. The dusty beams, the aged insulation, the emptiness. There was no sign that anyone or anything had been there. He still felt that unsettling tension in his chest, that bitter taste in his mouth, the clammy sweat on his hands, the tight grip on the ladder. He shut the door firmly and, using screws, secured the plywood over it, effectively sealing it off from below. He made sure it was firmly attached. He clenched and unclenched his fists, a nervous habit born of mounting tension. He didn't understand why he felt so uneasy. That night was worse. He woke up sweating, his heart hammering. He had heard a soft scraping sound, clearly originating from the hallway. He sat up in bed, his senses on high alert. He got up, turning on the light, his legs feeling strangely heavy. He walked to the hallway. The plywood was still in place, covering the attic access, but it looked slightly different. One corner seemed to have lifted by a mere fraction of an inch. He couldn't be entirely sure. He ran his finger along the edge. It felt tight. Maybe he was imagining it. He stood there for a long time, just staring, his hands trembling slightly. He breathed through his nose, trying to maintain his composure. He couldn't hear anything now, but he could feel something. The house felt charged, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. He set up a chair in the hallway and placed his phone on it, the camera recording, aimed directly at the plywood-covered attic access. He wanted to see if anything moved or changed when he wasn't directly observing it. He let it record for about an hour while he worked in another room. When he returned, he reviewed the footage. He doesn't plan to call in experts or rip the ceiling open again. He's done with that. The house is his now, and he'll live with whatever that presence is. It never touched him, never harmed him. And it was the stifling warmth that initially stirred me from my slumber. I tossed and turned, seeking a cool spot on the sheets, when a creeping unease began to settle in the pit of my stomach. It was then that I saw it, a silhouette at my window, a figure standing directly outside, seemingly waiting for the broken blinds to shift, to offer a glimpse of me within. My childhood imagination, long suppressed, suddenly roared back to life, conjuring images from every horror film I had ever seen. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blankets over my head, transforming my bed into a sweltering fabric oven. I endured the heat, preferring it to the unsettling sight outside my window. By morning, the figure was gone. The next morning, on the verge of tears, I rushed to my mother, Eleanor's, room, recounting the terrifying experience. She, however, dismissed it with a laugh, attributing it to a stray cat, suggesting it had climbed up to the window for some unknown feline reason. My window was quite high off the ground, making her explanation seem plausible, yet a nagging feeling of unease persisted. Later that day, while assisting with yard work, my gaze was drawn back to my window. One of our metal patio chairs had been moved, positioned directly beneath it. I pointed it out to Eleanor. She demanded I stop playing in the toolboxes in the garage. A collection of tools, screwdrivers, a hammer, flashlights had been meticulously placed on our doorstep. It wasn't me. I pleaded with Eleanor, begging her to stay up with me one night. Our garage was an open carport, offering no protection, and I refused to be punished for the actions of some unknown intruder. It was driving me to the brink of madness. Finally, she relented. That night, we would remain awake in the living room, a united front against the unseen threat. I eventually drifted off to sleep before Eleanor, but I remember her shaking me awake, panic etched on her face. She pointed to the window overlooking the garage. We could see the top of someone's head as they paced back and forth. The sound of metal tools being carefully placed on the brick steps reached our ears, as if the intruder was attempting to be quiet, but unable to completely muffle the noise. Eleanor whispered for me to wake Theodore. My father, enraged at being disturbed, grabbed his legally owned firearm and headed out the back door, towards the front of the house where the garage was located. We heard Theodore screaming, followed by the sound of someone dropping tools. Then, 2 gunshots rang out, shattering the night's silence. The frantic pounding of footsteps fleeing the garage felt like a physical blow, resonating in my chest. Eleanor cautiously peered out the window, then opened the door. Theodore stumbled inside. His aim, unsteady due to his sleep-deprived state, had missed both times. He informed us that a man had been crouching at our front door, examining the door handle. None of us slept that night. In the morning, law enforcement from the nearest town arrived. Their response was dishearteningly minimal. They inquired about any stolen items, asked for a description of the man, and then advised us to install security cameras. That was it. They suggested the intruder was likely seeking easy targets for quick cash. But if that were the case, why hadn't he stolen the tools, the generator, the welder, or broken into any of the vehicles parked in the open carport? We eventually installed hunting trail cameras around the house, but nothing further occurred. Even now, years later, returning home from college for holidays, I'm plagued by nightmares of that incident. When I sleep in my own bed, the fear returns visceral and overwhelming. I don't know what he was searching for, or why he engaged in such unsettling behavior, but the memory of that night, the unblinking eye of the night watcher, remains a chilling testament to the unseen dangers that can lurk just beyond our windows. The Prosecco and the Predator. In 2014, fueled by a thirst for adventure and a desire for self-discovery, the classic Find Myself narrative, Clara, migrated from Canada to England. I landed in Essex, sharing a 3-story flat with 3 other women, all older and, I initially thought, wiser than my 24-year-old self. There was Madeline, 31, a spirited New Yorker, Catherine, 34, hailing from New Jersey, and Anila, 38, a Polish immigrant. Our flat was a curious architectural specimen. The back of the home, encompassing the living room and kitchen, was a wall of glass, offering an unobstructed view of the fenced-in garden. The house had a peculiar energy, a repository of countless stories from that vibrant chapter of my life. I genuinely adored all my roommates, with one glaring exception, Catherine. After 7 months of enduring Catherine's volatile personality, My patience had worn thin. One evening, I returned home from work, diligently locked the door, prepared a simple meal, and retreated to my bedroom. I had brought some work home, and I was immersed in paperwork, headphones on, lost in music. The headphones were a deliberate choice, a sonic barrier against Catherine's predictable outbursts. She was out to dinner with colleagues, a scenario that invariably involved copious amounts of alcohol, followed by a dramatic, tearful meltdown. I simply couldn't bear to witness another one. I was deeply engrossed in my work, oblivious to the world around me, when a subtle shift in the atmosphere made me look up. Standing over me was a man. The realization didn't register immediately. My brain, still half submerged in work, processed him as a misplaced visitor. Catherine's room is on the second floor, I said passively, returning to my papers. He didn't move. Catherine's room is downstairs, you? I began again before he interrupted, his voice a chilling counterpoint to my oblivious calm. I'm not here for Catherine. A wave of icy dread washed over me. My fight-or-flight response, dormant until that moment, surged to life. My eyes scanned him, taking in every detail. Approximately 5 feet 10 inches, wild, muddy brown hair, and eyes that were alarmingly black. He wore a light blue polo shirt, one side of the collar carelessly popped, and his accent was distinctly Mancunian. It was then that I understood the unsettling darkness of his eyes. His pupils were completely dilated. I was in serious trouble. I needed an escape plan. Unfortunately, this intruder stood between me and my bedroom door. My only route to safety was downstairs, but I needed to make him believe it was his idea. I decided to play along, to feign compliance. He used his knife, a wickedly sharp blade that glinted in the dim light, to pop the cork of a bottle of Prosecco he held in his other hand. The sparkling wine frothed over, spilling onto my carpet. "Oh no," I said, trying to inject a note of casual concern into my voice. "Let's clean that up. I prefer to drink out of a proper flute. Anyway." He nodded, his gaze unsettlingly intense. "Yeah, you're a proper classy bird. Let's go." The descent to the main floor was a slow-motion nightmare. He held the back of my nightgown bunched in one hand, the point of the knife grazing my back with his other. I attempted to engage him in playful banter, my words a desperate attempt to mask the tremor in my voice, the frantic beating of my heart. I couldn't hear anything over the blood rushing in my ears. We reached the bottom of the stairs. To my left, a hallway led to the front door. To my right, much closer, was the kitchen and living room. We entered the kitchen. I pointed towards the cabinets where the wine glasses were stored. He claimed to know their location and moved towards them. Now the kitchen table stood between us, a meager barrier, but a barrier nonetheless. It was time to run. I sprinted towards the hallway, my feet pounding on the floor, my hands fumbling with the locks on the front door. Had shoved me aside. One of the men gave chase, pursuing the fleeing intruder, while the other urged me to go back inside, promising to secure the house while I called the police. I slammed the door shut, engaging the locks, and dialed the emergency number, my voice shaking uncontrollably. As I spoke to the dispatcher, I frantically checked the windows and doors, ensuring they were all secure. A sudden, deafening bang on the front door sent my heart leaping into my throat. I informed the dispatcher, my voice rising in panic. She assured me that the police were not yet on the scene. Thinking it might be one of the helpful gentlemen, I cautiously approached the door, peering through the peephole. It was him, the intruder. He yelled at us, blood dripping from his wound, his anger a terrifying spectacle. Beatrice inexplicably forgave him. He undoubtedly concocted a litany of excuses in the following days, weaving a narrative that somehow absolved him of responsibility. In early 2002, Beatrice finally decided to take a break from their tumultuous relationship. She and I moved into a different apartment, seeking distance and respite. I, still clinging to the misguided notion of having two fathers, resented the separation. I had grown accustomed to Richard's presence. Despite his flaws, and the upheaval felt like another painful fracture in my already fragmented family life. I ignored the warning signs, the subtle indicators of a darkness I couldn't yet grasp. My story truly begins on Thursday, August 8th, 2002. I was at school, feeling unwell, and noticed a peculiar rash spreading across my hips. My teacher, concerned, sent me to the doctor. The diagnosis: shingles. I can still vividly recall the doctor's words, his face a mask of professional concern, warning me that if the rash worsened and encircled my hip, it could pose a serious threat. I was sent home for the day, granted permission to stay home the following Friday as well. Friday morning, August 9th. Beatrice woke me up about 20 minutes before she left for work. She checked on me, prepared a small breakfast, and tucked me back into bed, ensuring I would rest and recover. After she left, I lay in bed, relieved to find that the rash had, thankfully, improved overnight. Then, I heard a noise emanating from the hallway. My bedroom wasn't directly connected to the hallway, so I could only see the adjacent room. Assuming it was Beatrice, having perhaps forgotten something, I called out to her. Seconds later, Richard, my mother's ex-boyfriend, appeared in my doorway. His presence was unexpected, unsettling. He inquired about my absence from school. After I explained my illness, he launched into a sentimental monologue, expressing how much he missed us, me, my sisters, and Beatrice. He spoke of regret, of wanting to reconcile, to mend the broken pieces of our fractured family. I, still blinded by a childish desire for familial unity, responded with equally naive sentiments. "I miss you too," I confessed, unbelievably believing that reconciliation was possible, desirable even. I can't believe I was so incredibly foolish. After a few minutes of strained small talk, during which he feigned concern for my well-being, he extracted a promise from me, not to tell Beatrice about his visit. I, of course, betrayed that promise the moment she returned home. I couldn't keep secrets from her, and on some level I wanted her to know. However, as a naive 12-year-old, I failed to question how he had gained entry to the apartment without a key, without anyone letting him in. It never occurred to me that his actions were illegal, inappropriate, a violation. He was a familiar figure, someone who had shared our home for years. Later that same day, just hours after Richard's clandestine visit, my father, Daniel, drove me to my grandmother, Evelyn's house. I had prearranged to spend the weekend with her, and I was already feeling significantly better. Beatrice was scheduled to pick me up on Sunday. But on Sunday morning, Beatrice didn't answer her phone. 12 hours passed, an unusual silence that sent a shiver of unease down my spine. A family friend, Mr. Thompson, picked me up and drove me back to my apartment. Still, no word from Beatrice. In our country, there's a legal protocol. A person must be missing for 24 hours before authorities can forcibly enter their residence. Beatrice had vanished on Saturday evening. The police couldn't breach the apartment until Sunday. My sisters, Daniel, and I entered the apartment together, staring at the ceiling in the darkness. The street outside his suburban home was quiet, the usual nocturnal sounds muted. Then he heard it, a single sharp bark that pierced the stillness. It made him tense up, a jolt of unexpected noise. He remained still, waiting, listening to see if it would be repeated. About a minute later, he heard another bark. It was distant, but not too far away, perhaps originating from the overgrown bushes behind his fence or from the narrow alleyway that ran alongside his garage. He couldn't pinpoint the exact location. By the third night, Michael felt like a zombie. His eyes were dry and gritty, his neck stiff, his head heavy and aching. He felt sluggish and irritable. That night, he stepped out onto the small concrete step behind his back door. It was cold, and he felt a chill on his bare arms. He was wearing only a t-shirt and sweatpants. He pointed the flashlight towards the fence line. He saw nothing. He switched it off and waited, his senses on high alert. The bark sounded again. Sounded like a dog, but also not quite right. Something about its tone was off. It was low and had a rough, guttural quality that made him uneasy. He stepped back inside, locked the door, and sat in the kitchen, trying to gather his thoughts. He didn't manage to get more than 2 hours of sleep that night. By the fourth night, Michael had reached his limit. He decided he would go outside and investigate thoroughly, even if it meant crawling through undergrowth. He prepared earlier in the evening. He put on jeans, sturdy boots, and a jacket with ample pockets. He grabbed a powerful flashlight. He waited until the barking started. When he heard it, he moved quietly, deliberately minimizing any noise as he opened doors and navigated the fence gate. He went into his backyard, scanning the area with the flashlight switched off at first. He stood there for a long moment, listening. He thought he could hear a faint breathing sound, but he couldn't be sure. Then a bark came from behind his fence. He switched on the flashlight and went out through the side gate, stepping onto the narrow strip of grass that ran behind his property line. There was a chain link fence there, separating his property from a small patch of undeveloped land, overgrown with weeds, wild grass, and low-lying bushes. A distant streetlight provided minimal illumination, casting long, distorted shadows. He pointed his flashlight at the ground, searching for footprints or any indication of an animal's presence. He saw flattened grass, suggesting something had been lying there, and it looked relatively recent. He moved the beam around, scanning the darkness. He heard a rustle, the sound of something shifting its weight on dry leaves. He aimed the flashlight at the source of the noise. He saw something crouching. It looked too large to be a typical dog. It was low to the ground, but he could discern the outline of a head and shoulders that seemed strangely proportioned. He couldn't see fur clearly. The skin appeared grayish, or perhaps simply dull under the beam of his flashlight. It turned its head towards him. Its eyes reflected the light, but not with the characteristic bright glow of a dog's eyes at night. These were dull, not shining, just reflecting light in an uneven, unsettling way. He didn't say anything. He didn't move closer. His heart was pounding, and he could feel sweat forming on his forehead. He gripped the flashlight tightly. The creature made a soft, low sound, not quite a growl, but a kind of guttural grunt. Then it barked. Michael jumped slightly, startled, and took a step back. It didn't run. It remained crouched, watching him. He noticed that the shape of its body was wrong. The limbs looked too long, the back legs bent at an unnatural angle. He tried to focus the light more directly, but the creature moved. It sort of slid sideways, still low to the ground, then disappeared behind a clump of tall grass. He stood there for a minute or two, listening. He could hear distant traffic, the hum of the streetlight, his own ragged breathing. He heard no more barks. Eventually, he turned off his flashlight and walked back to his yard. He locked the gate behind him, went inside, and sat in his living room, feeling deeply unsettled. He didn't know what he had seen. It was clearly not a normal stray dog. It was something else, but he had no idea what to do about it. The next day, Michael tried to focus on work, but the image of the creature kept intruding on his thoughts. He drank copious amounts of coffee, trying to combat the fatigue and mental fog. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Michael stood there, his heart hammering, gripping the wrench tightly. He didn't dare climb the fence or approach too closely. The creature paced a bit behind the grass, its outline shifting. He could hear its breathing, a steady, rasping sound. He noticed a smell, a peculiar odor, like damp earth and old leaves, but with a subtle underlying hint of something else, perhaps a faint, rotten scent. He wanted to retreat, to escape the unnerving presence, but he also felt a compelling need to see more, to understand what he was dealing with. He stepped closer, shining the flashlight directly at it. The creature flinched at the light, backing away a few steps. He could see something like loose skin on its neck, or perhaps uneven patches of fur. It opened its mouth again, displaying those unsettling teeth, and emitted a short, sharp bark. Michael took another step forward, and it moved quickly to the side, disappearing into the darkness. But unlike anything he had ever encountered, his barking sounded fake, like a deliberate imitation. Why would it linger around his property every night? Was it searching for something? Food? He had never heard of strange animals roaming this area. It was a typical suburban neighborhood, with mostly small homes and fenced yards. Over the next few nights, he tried different strategies. He tried remaining completely silent, just peeking out through a gap in the fence. He caught a glimpse of it from behind once, observing its hunched spine and patches of thin, dark hair. The rest of its body appeared pale, almost luminous in the darkness. It continued to make those unsettling barking sounds at intervals, as if testing something. He tried whistling once, but it didn't react. He tried tossing a small rock into the brush, hoping to startle it, to provoke some revealing movement. It only crouched lower. It seemed cautious, but not truly afraid. It never entered his yard. It always remained just beyond his fence. He noticed that the barking consistently started around the same time, roughly midnight or shortly thereafter. It lasted for an hour or two, intermittently, then ceased. He never saw it leave. It simply stopped making noise, and eventually, he realized he could no longer hear it. Perhaps it moved away silently, or maybe it simply remained still, hidden in the darkness, until he gave up watching. He began to feel paranoid. He blocked his windows with old blankets to prevent any light from escaping. He dimmed his phone screen brightness, minimizing any glow. He tried to catch the creature off guard, to gain a clearer view. He never succeeded. It was always just a shape, a fleeting glimpse of a face, the outline of limbs that were too long, too wrong. Sometimes, he thought he saw fingers instead of paws. Once, he thought he saw it grasp a branch to steady itself. The idea of it possessing hands filled him with a profound sense of dread. And the motion light flickered on for a brief second. He saw the creature, illuminated. It stood on all fours, its spine unnaturally arched. Its skin looked rough and patchy, with sparse, thin hair along its shoulders. Its head was turned towards his fence. He saw its face more clearly this time. It had a flat nose, a wide mouth with uneven, pointed teeth. Its eyes were small and dark. Then, it jerked its head towards the light, seemingly noticing it. It backed away, moving awkwardly. He saw that its front limbs resembled arms, bending at what looked like elbows. He still thinks about what it might be, but he has no proof, no tangible evidence, only those unsettling nighttime encounters. The smell of damp earth, the sight of that hunched, distorted shape, the sound of that strange, artificial bark. He doesn't know what it wants. He doesn't know why it chose his fence line. He just knows it's out there, and he can't stop it. So, worried that my shirt might ride up while I hung upside down, or that stretching my hamstrings might provide them with some unwanted show. These were adults, and I was a minor. I found it odd, but assumed it would pass me by. The sedan was in the oncoming lane, so we were facing each other for a few brief meters. It slowed down considerably, then pulled over to the curb. My alarm bells, already primed from the previous encounter, began to clang. The car was now parked, facing me, and my suspicions intensified as the driver's side door opened.
Atal Baltman.
Built like a refrigerator, emerged and crossed over to the passenger side. But I tell you, in that split second, before he had even stepped in front of the first headlight, before my foot could complete another rhythmic stride of my jog, my brain unleashed a surge of adrenaline so potent that I actually leaped into the air. My body reacted instinctively, overriding any conscious thought. My foot landed, propelling me off the pavement. I spun around in midair, darting in a new direction, away from the approaching man. The phrase fight or flight ceased to be a mere figure of speech. I experienced it viscerally as my body took over, putting me into autopilot. And my autopilot, it turned out, was programmed for flight, a flight so powerful that it felt like a glitch in the matrix, a momentary defiance of gravity. I didn't head towards the sidewalk. That would have been too predictable, too easy for him to follow in his car. Instead, I found myself running through backyards, leaping over fences, navigating a familiar landscape with an unfamiliar urgency. I wish I could claim I had never run so fast, but As you know, I had already experienced a similar burst of adrenaline-fueled speed. I dared to glance over my shoulder and saw a dark blur, a large human form, moving unnaturally quickly through the backyards, pursuing me. I don't know how I managed to outrun him. Perhaps it was my intimate knowledge of the neighborhood, having lived there my entire life, knowing which houses had fences, which ones offered more cover, which ones led to dead ends. I burst into my house, breathless and terrified, recounting the entire story to anyone who would listen. To be frank, no one seemed particularly concerned. I had no concrete evidence, no proof of his intentions. There was room for doubt, the possibility that I had misinterpreted his actions. Maybe he had simply stopped to ask for directions or to check a tire. That's what my family chose to believe, at least initially. For a long time, I felt a simmering rage. These men had invaded my space, my home, my neighborhood, instilling a fear that lingered long after they were gone. I couldn't fathom the mindset of someone who would willingly violate another person's sense of safety. But men like these, it seemed, did it recreationally. Deliberate pace seemed strangely incongruous with the speed of the vehicle. Ethan glanced at him as he passed, catching a glimpse of short, dark hair and a pale neck, but no distinct facial features. The man didn't turn, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. He was just a quiet, solitary figure on the side of the highway. Ethan shrugged it off, attributing it to the strangeness of late-night encounters. He continued driving. A minute or so later, a prickle of unease crawled up his spine. He noticed something ahead, in the diary of his headlights. Another figure walking on the right-hand shoulder of the road. As he drew closer, his stomach tightened. It looked like the same man. Same posture, same slow, deliberate steps, same dark clothing. He was slightly hunched over, as if burdened by fatigue. But how could this be? He had just passed him, less than a mile back. Straining to hear if the man said anything. He didn't. He just kept walking, his movements mechanical and unvarying. He noticed the man wore worn-out trousers and a thin jacket. His shoes looked dusty, as if he had been walking for a considerable distance. But there was no sign of perspiration, no indication of exertion. Still, he couldn't see his face, only the back of his head, his short, dark hair, and the back of his jacket. Ethan passed him again and accelerated, increasing his speed to at least 50 miles per hour. He kept checking his rearview mirrors. Nothing behind him, nothing in the adjacent fields. He turned on the radio, seeking some distraction, some human connection, but there was no reception, only static. He switched it off, the silence returning, punctuated only by the hum of his car's engine. His heart was beating faster now, a noticeable thumping in his chest. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve, realizing he was sweating, despite the cool night air. He tried to rationalize what he was seeing. Maybe he was mistaken. Maybe the first man and the second man were different individuals. Maybe it was some bizarre, improbable coincidence. He tried to calm himself to focus on the road. But a few minutes later, he saw him again. The same posture, the same slow, deliberate steps, a head on the shoulder. He slammed on the brakes, slowing the car to a crawl. A wave of nausea washed over him. His breathing became shallow and rapid. He considered turning around, retracing his route, but where would he go? The nearest town was behind him, several miles distant. The next town ahead was even farther. He was trapped, confined to this empty stretch of highway, with this inexplicable recurring figure. This time, he stopped the car about 20 feet behind the man. He left the engine running and activated his hazard lights, hoping the flashing lights might elicit some response. He leaned out the window and called out, "Hey!" His voice sounded strained, unsteady. He waited. The man didn't turn. He kept walking, his shoulders moving slightly with each step, but otherwise unchanging. Ethan got out of the car, his legs feeling stiff, his hands trembling. He took a few tentative steps towards the man. The gravel on the shoulder crunched audibly beneath his shoes. He could smell the dust in the air. He called out again, louder this time.
Hey, Mann.
What's going on? No answer. He walked closer, his heart pounding, a cold sweat forming on his back. He stopped about 6 feet behind the man. He kept walking at that same slow, inexorable pace. He could see the man's jacket was old and frayed at the bottom. He noticed a small tear on the right shoulder. His hair was short and neat, but it didn't appear to be styled. He reached out, his voice strained. "Dude, can you hear me?" Still nothing. He considered touching the man, placing a hand on his shoulder, but something held him back, an instinctive aversion, a primal fear. He felt a heaviness in his arms, a coldness in his chest. Instead, he stepped back. He moved around, attempting to see the man's face from the side, walking backward as he did so. But as soon as he tried to gain a diagonal view, the man seemed to subtly adjust his angle, maintaining his obscurity. He never got a clear look. He stumbled back to the car, keeping his eyes fixed on the figure. He got in, locked the doors, and sat there, breathing heavily. The man just kept walking ahead, slowly, steadily. He didn't know what else to do. He didn't have cell service, rendering any attempt to call for help futile. He told himself to simply drive around the man again and continue on his way. Maybe he would eventually disappear. He pulled back onto the road and passed the man once more. This time, he didn't look at him. He focused straight ahead, pressing the accelerator. His car felt like a safe haven, the tires humming on the asphalt, the headlights illuminating the vast emptiness ahead. The night was silent, save for the sound of his engine. He checked the rearview mirror. He saw the man receding into the distance, shrinking with each passing second. After a while, he was gone from sight. He kept going. 10 minutes later, his jaw clenched, up ahead, and executed a careful U-turn. The headlights swept across the empty fields. When he was facing the opposite direction, he pressed the gas pedal and drove, the thought of escape fueling his actions. He drove for perhaps 5 minutes, feeling a flicker of hope, a slight easing of the tension. The road behind him looked identical. Asphalt, shoulder, empty fields. But then his heart sank. In the distance, his headlights revealed a figure walking on the shoulder. It was him again. Now he was ahead of him on the same side of the road, walking away from him. Somehow, he was blocking both directions. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching again. He cursed under his breath, a guttural sound of frustration and fear. He wanted to scream, to release the pent-up tension, but he held it in. He moved forward slowly. The man never turned around. He never altered his pace. It was as if he were trapped in an endless loop. He tried honking the horn this time, the sound sharp and jarring, piercing the silence. The man didn't react. He honked again, longer this time. Still nothing. He just kept walking. He pressed the horn and held it down, the continuous blare filling the car and the surrounding emptiness. But the man ignored it completely. He released the horn, his ears ringing. His heart was beating erratically, too fast. He was breathing through his mouth, his throat parched. He considered getting out of the car again, but he was afraid, a primal fear gripping him. He felt a tightness in his chest, a strange tension in his legs. His head felt hot, his palms clammy on the steering wheel. He checked the glove compartment. He had nothing useful. No weapon, no flashlight besides the one on his phone, no phone signal. Just him and this relentless, inexplicable figure. He decided to drive past him again, this time swerving into the left lane to maintain maximum distance. As he rolled past, he tried once more to see the man's face. He leaned over the passenger seat, keeping one hand on the wheel, but all he caught was a glimpse of a pale cheek and perhaps the edge of an ear. The man kept his head angled down and forward, as if deliberately avoiding his gaze. He drove on. He forced himself to keep going, to ignore the man. He told himself to treat him like a hallucination, to simply continue driving until he reached a real town, a gas station, a diner, something with people. He would find help there. He would ask them to come back with him. He would show them. They would see it too. Or maybe they wouldn't. He thought about abandoning the car and walking into the fields, but he had no idea what lay out there in the darkness. Just emptiness and silence. No lights, no houses, no signs, nothing. He tried turning on the radio again, hoping to catch any signal, any human voice. Nothing but static. He tried his phone one more time. No signal. The battery was still adequate, but it didn't matter. He was utterly isolated. He drove back and forth a few times, testing a theory. He would drive forward until he saw the man. Then he would turn around and drive back until he saw him again. No matter which direction he went, the man was always ahead of him, always walking in the same direction he was driving, always ignoring him. After an hour of this maddening, futile exercise, he felt utterly exhausted. His shoulders ached from the constant tension. His eyes burned from staring into the darkness. His heart still raced, and his mouth felt like sandpaper. He tried to drink some water from a bottle he had on the passenger seat. It was warm and stale, but it provided some slight relief. Eventually, he decided to try something different. He pulled over, got out of the car, and walked towards the man again. This time, he had his phone's flashlight switched on. The man was about 30 feet ahead. He approached slowly, shining the light on the man's back. His jacket looked brown under the beam. He noticed dust on his shoulders and small stains on his trousers. He listened intently, trying to hear breathing or footfalls. All he heard was a faint shuffle as the man's shoes touched the ground. He moved closer, his heart pounding in his ears. He lifted the flashlight and tried to step to the side, to see the man's face. He moved quickly. For a split second, he saw part of his cheek and his eye. His eye looked normal, just an eye, brown, he thought. But the moment he tried to get a full look, the man seemed to shift position, smoothly, effortlessly. It stood at the campus's center, a silent sentinel watching over the newer, less imposing buildings. But the most prominent feature, the one that drew the eye and sparked the imagination, was the old windmill, a designated historical landmark. It was once the cherished playhouse of the estate owner's daughter. The local legend surrounding the windmill was both tragic and chilling. The daughter, it was said, would race to the top floor, her laughter echoing through the structure, to wave at the seafaring vessels sailing past on the distant horizon. One fateful night, a constant reminder that the world is far stranger, far more mysterious than we often give it credit for. And sometimes, the most unsettling experiences are those that leave us with more questions than answers, forever suspended in a realm of uneasy uncertainty. The memory is now more than just a creepy story. It is a subtle but permanent shift in my perception of the world. I began researching local lore more, even beyond the well-known windmill story. I even tentatively started attending a few local historical society meetings, always listening more than I spoke, hoping for some kind of explanation, some parallel that never quite materialized. The uncertainty, that's what truly haunts, the stare of the second-hand stalker. This incident, while perhaps not overtly life-threatening in the traditional sense, my past experiences, two separate, terrifying near abductions, had left me with a lingering case of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, CPTSD. As a result, venturing out into public spaces alone was a significant challenge. I could manage work and classes, where the routines and familiar faces offered a semblance of security. But anything beyond that required a companion. Thankfully, Alexander was more than just a boyfriend. He was my steadfast protector, my anchor in a world that often felt overwhelming. He's a towering 6 feet 3 inches, lean but muscular, with a deep, resonant voice that could intimidate even the most hardened individuals. More importantly, he possessed an unwavering willingness to defend me, physically if necessary, a trait that, while I hoped would never be tested, provided a deep sense of comfort. Our area, unfortunately, has a dark underbelly. We live in northern Wisconsin, close to the sprawling metropolis of Minneapolis. Interstate 94 cuts through our town, a direct artery to the city, and a notorious route for human trafficking. The Wisconsin Dells, a popular tourist destination, is not far, and I grew up knowing the grim reality of trafficking in that area. fueled by the constant influx of unsuspecting visitors. Even Baraboo, my eyes scanning the rows of furniture. Sure enough, in the aisle behind me stood a middle-aged man, his gaze fixed on me. He wasn't smiling, wasn't frowning, just staring. His expression was blank, unreadable. I was dressed in a skirt and knee-high socks, a style I often favored. Being ogled by creepy men was, unfortunately, a familiar experience. But, given my solitary state and my heightened anxiety, I decided to avoid confrontation. I offered him the perfunctory, half-hearted smile so common in Midwestern culture, a gesture meant to acknowledge his presence without encouraging further interaction. Then, I moved further down the aisle towards a corner of the section. Suddenly, the man practically sprinted to the row where I was standing. His movements were jarring, abrupt. I took a sharp right, attempting to create distance, heading towards the area where he had initially been standing. He mirrored my movements, picking up his pace. We were now engaged in a bizarre, silent chase around the furniture, a macabre dance of predator and prey. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the backdrop of the quiet store. Finally, we reached a stalemate. I stood on one side of a row of desks, he on the other, his gaze unwavering, waiting to see which direction I would choose. I tried to appear calm, feigning interest in the surrounding furniture. I glanced to my left, towards the restrooms and the other sections of the store, desperately seeking a witness, someone who could disrupt this unsettling tableau. And then I saw him, Alexander. He had emerged from the restroom and was walking towards us, his posture rigid, his expression thunderous. His eyes were locked onto the man who had been pursuing me, a silent promise of retribution in their depths. He reached my side, placing a protective arm around my shoulder. He and the man locked eyes, a silent confrontation between two vastly different forces. The man, who had seemed so bold, so relentless just moments before, now appeared deflated, his predatory energy dissipating. He didn't speak. He simply turned and walked away. But even as he retreated, his presence lingered. Every few minutes, we would spot him, lurking in the periphery, his gaze fixed on us from a distance. My anxiety, already simmering, reached a boiling point. I wanted to leave, to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the store. But Alexander, ever the pragmatist, was attempting to reassure me, to distract me with his familiar brand of dry humor, with little success. He eventually managed to divert my attention by locating the perfect side table, a dark cherry wood piece with a glass door and elegant shelves, exactly what I had been searching for. And it was only $30, a steal, plus a student discount. We carried the table towards the checkout, my paranoia still raging. I constantly scanned the surroundings, searching for the man. I can't prove that he was connected to the trafficking rings that plagued our area, but I am equally certain that his intentions were far from pure. The way he chased me, the way he stalked me through the store, the unwavering intensity of his gaze, it all pointed to something far more sinister than mere curiosity. The unsettling encounter left a residue of fear, a heightened awareness of the potential dangers that lurk even in the most ordinary of places. It served as a chilling reminder that vigilance and the presence of a strong protector are sometimes the only barriers between safety and a far darker reality. The elevator's unseen passenger. It was a mundane errand, a task that should have taken no more than a few minutes. Late in the afternoon, Daniel walked into the lobby of a nondescript office building. The place was quiet, almost deserted. He needed to go up to the 7th floor to retrieve a document. He wasn't preoccupied with any particular worries. He was simply tired and eager to complete his task and head home. The elevator doors slid open, revealing an empty car. He stepped inside, pressed the button for the 7th floor, and waited. There was a gentle hum as the elevator began its ascent. The ride felt normal, unremarkable. After a few seconds, the elevator slowed and stopped, a desperate attempt to make the elevator stop at the next floor, hoping to jump out. The presence stood between him and the door, blocking any escape. He could feel it there, so close, yet utterly invisible. He tried speaking, his voice trembling. "Who are you? What do you want?" No reply. He reached out carefully, his hand encountering something solid, something that felt like a shoulder. He tried to push it, to force his way past. Pushed back with surprising strength. He stepped to the side, attempting to circumvent the obstruction. He felt an arm, or something resembling an arm, pressing against his chest, shoving him back towards the rear wall of the elevator. He stumbled, nearly losing his balance. He tried pressing the open door button repeatedly, frantically, but the elevator ignored his commands. Continued moving, but he couldn't discern whether it was ascending or descending. His stomach felt heavy, his breathing shallow and rapid. He yelled for help, his voice desperate and echoing within the confined space. No one answered. The presence remained silent, a chilling, unresponsive force. He swung his arm through the air, hoping to make contact, to dislodge it, to somehow break free. He connected with what felt like a torso, a solid, human-like form. It felt like punching a person, the impact jarring his arm. In response, the presence grabbed his arm, its grip incredibly strong. He felt invisible fingers digging into his flesh, twisting his arm with painful force. He cried out in pain and stopped struggling. It released him. He leaned against the wall, cradling his injured arm, his body trembling. He tried pressing the emergency intercom button again. No sound. He tried the elevator's phone panel, pulling it open. The phone was there, but there was no dial tone. Dead. He slammed it back in frustration. He had to get out. He tried reaching up to the ceiling hatch, hoping to find an escape route. It was locked. He pulled and pried, but it wouldn't budge. The presence, sensing his intention, reached up and grabbed his leg below him, hindering him and stopping him from climbing, causing him to nearly fall. He kicked out, just an empty elevator. But when he moved the light across the area where he felt the presence, it revealed nothing. He swung his keys in front of him, and they struck something invisible, stopping abruptly in midair. He felt a tug as the presence attempted to knock them from his hand. Eventually, it succeeded, and his keys clattered to the floor. He snatched them back quickly, his heart pounding. He pressed himself into a corner, trying to think, to formulate a plan. He couldn't see it, couldn't reason with it, couldn't communicate with it. It wouldn't speak. It only responded with force, with brute strength. He tried slowly approaching the door again. The elevator stopped once more. The doors opened a crack, revealing a hallway. He lunged forward, trying to squeeze through the narrow opening. The presence slammed him back inside, the doors closing with a thud. He yelled at it, cursed at it, his voice filled with rage and fear, but it remained silent, an implacable, unseen barrier. He punched the wall, feeling the pain in his knuckles, a sharp, stinging sensation. He tried again with the alarm button, his actions fueled by desperation. The elevator continued its silent journey, ignoring his frantic attempts to escape. His heart was racing, a frantic drumbeat against his ribs. He could feel sweat dripping down his back, his shirt clinging to his skin. His mouth felt parched. He tried to calm himself, to conserve his energy, but it was difficult. He kept glancing around, his eyes searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening, but finding only the empty, mundane reality of an ordinary elevator. He had to try something else. He approached the control panel and, using his keys, pried at a small panel beneath it. He managed to open it slightly, revealing a tangle of wires. He pulled one at random. The elevator jerked violently, and the lights flickered. The presence retaliated, striking his hand, making him drop the keys inside the panel. He cursed and tried to reach in, but the presence pulled him back, its grip on his shoulder tight and painful. He tried kicking the panel. The presence grabbed his wrist, twisting it with agonizing force, forcing him to stop. He cried out, a strangled gasp of pain. He leaned against the wall again, breathing heavily, defeated. The elevator continued its silent, erratic journey, ignoring his inputs, and Michael was hunched over his desk in the small room he used as a home office. The lights were on, a necessary countermeasure against the darkness that he usually avoided while working. His laptop screen glowed, illuminating scattered documents and notes. His back was to the window, and he hadn't bothered to close the blinds, as there were no streetlights directly behind his house, just a few shrubs and the fencing that marked his property line. It was typically just an expanse of inky blackness. But that night, as he leaned back in his chair, stretching his tired muscles, he glanced at the window. He saw his own reflection as expected, but he also saw something else. Behind his reflected image, there was another reflection, a humanoid figure standing silently. He froze, his body instantly rigid with alarm. His heart began to pound, a heavy, insistent thudding in his chest. He swiveled around in his chair, expecting to confront an intruder. There was no one there. The room was empty. He scanned the space. His desk, his chair, the shelves lined with binders, the small couch in the corner. The office door was closed, and he hadn't heard it open. He looked under the table, behind the door, a futile gesture, but one born of instinct. Nothing. Then he looked back at the window. The figure was still there, visible only in the reflection. It was right behind where he had been sitting, a dark, person-shaped shadow, standing completely motionless. He couldn't discern any facial features. It was like a silhouette, taller than him by several inches. He stared at it, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. He tried to make out more details. He couldn't see any clothing, hair, or features, just a form that vaguely resembled a human body. The shoulders, the head, the posture. It looked solid, not like some random amorphous shape. Every time he looked at the window, it was there in the reflection, but not in the captured images. He felt his heart thumping, his palms sweating. He wiped them on his pants. If he moved closer to the window, he could still see it, always behind him. It was as if it maintained a fixed point in the room, but its position relative to him changed as he moved. He tried standing all the way to the left side of the room, then to the right. The figure's position shifted accordingly, always keeping the same relative angle behind him. It never moved on its own. It never raised an arm or tilted its head or made any gesture whatsoever. It was just a static, unchanging shape. He felt the hairs on his arms stand on end. His stomach felt tense. His head was pounding. He kept asking himself what this thing could be. He tried to think of anything that could cause such a strange reflection. Some object outside, a peculiar shape created by a combination of light sources. But there was nothing. Nothing outside but an empty yard and a fence. No lights that could cast a shape like that. He reached out and touched the window again, pressing his fingertips against the cool glass. He ran his hand along the surface, feeling for any imperfections, any irregularities. Felt smooth and cold. He breathed slowly, trying to control his rising panic. He looked at his own face in the reflection. His eyes, his nose, his mouth, his shoulders, his hair, his shirt. All of that was correct. It looked like a normal reflection, except for that figure behind him, that figure that didn't correspond to anything physically present in the room. The subtle, almost imperceptible buzz of electricity in the overhead lights. Nothing unusual. He got up and turned off the laptop screen, eliminating that source of light, reducing any potential glare. The reflection became dimmer, but he could still see the figure behind him, a darker shape against the slightly less reflective surface. He turned off the lamp on his desk. Now, the room was illuminated only by the ceiling light. The figure remained visible, its presence unaffected by the changes in brightness. He turned all the lights off in the room and turned on the hallway light instead. He looked back at the window. The figure was still there, darker, but undeniably present. He began to feel a suffocating pressure in his chest, a desperate urge to flee the house, to escape this inexplicable phenomenon. But he also felt a strange, morbid curiosity, a compelling need to understand what was happening. He decided to try another experiment. He grabbed a piece of paper and held it behind him while looking at the reflection. He wanted to see if the figure would be partially obscured, if it would interact with a physical object in the room. He held the paper up, moving it around. His reflection showed him holding the piece of paper behind himself. The figure, however, remained unchanged, as if it were behind the paper, unaffected by its presence. He could see everything else clearly. He could touch things, feel things. The only anomaly was in that window, that one persistent, unsettling reflection. He went to the kitchen and grabbed a small flashlight. He returned to the office and shone the flashlight at the glass, trying different angles, searching for some explanation. But the figure remained unchanged, its presence seemingly independent of the light source. The flashlight beam revealed dust on the glass, some smudges, but nothing that could account for the persistent humanoid shape. He decided to block the reflection entirely. He stood there for a moment, staring at the blank cardboard, half expecting it to somehow display the figure's outline. But it was just cardboard, inert and unresponsive. He tapped on it. He knocked lightly. Nothing happened. He waited, listening intently. He heard his own breathing, a slight ringing in his ears from the silence. After a few minutes, he felt a measure of calm return. The figure was out of sight. If he couldn't see it, perhaps he could temporarily ignore it. He turned off the lights and left the office, locking the door out of habit. Even though the gesture felt utterly pointless, he moved to the living room and sat on the couch. He tried to think about something else, anything else, but every time he closed his eyes, he opened it and turned on the light. The cardboard still covered the window. He stood in front of it, hesitating. Then, slowly, deliberately, he removed the tape and took the cardboard down. He just wanted to sit in the living room, leave the TV on for some background noise, and try to calm his racing thoughts. He walked to the living room, turned on the TV, and set the volume to a low level. He sat on the couch, trying to listen to the quiet murmur of voices. He tried not to think too much. He kept feeling that tightness in his chest. His throat was still dry. He drank slowly. The kitchen felt safe. It was quiet, and there were no windows facing that side of the house. He stood there, leaning against the counter, his mind still racing. He looked at the clock. It was close to 3 a.m. He decided not to return to the office for the rest of the night. He turned off a few lights, leaving only the living room lamp on. He lay down on the couch, his phone in his hand, just in case. He thought about calling someone again, but it was too late. He just lay there, listening to the quiet sounds of the house, waiting for morning. He knew that behind that closed office door, covered by cardboard and blinds, the window reflection still held that figure. He couldn't explain it. He couldn't get rid of it. He could only wait and see what happened next. Johnny in the wall, a spectral handyman. Before this incident, I was a staunch skeptic, a devotee of logic and reason, while my parents, Elijah and Miriam, often regaled me with tales of their youthful encounters with the paranormal. I remained unconvinced. Upon hearing my frantic tale of bolting from the apartment with a toddler and a mattress, burst into laughter. I couldn't blame him. I would likely have reacted the same way had the roles been reversed. But in the midst of his laughter, he remembered something. He stopped abruptly. "Hey," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "Wasn't Johnny the name of Florence's husband? The one who used to live in your apartment? Let's rewind a few months to when I was initially moving into the apartment. As I was unloading belongings from my pickup truck, I encountered a sweet, elderly woman walking her 2 small dogs in the courtyard in front of the complex. I introduced myself, mentioning that I was moving into the building. She introduced herself as Florence, but preferred to be called Flo by those she knew. We exchanged pleasantries, and I was relieved by her clarification. Fast forward back to the night of the incident. Theodore's suggestion that I speak to Flo, perhaps show her a picture of her deceased husband to see if Samuel could identify him, resonated deeply. I wasn't sure how I felt about stirring up her emotions so soon after her loss, but the urgency of the situation, the need to determine if Samuel had indeed seen a benign spirit or something potentially more malevolent, compelled me to act. The next day, I resolved to do just that, not only to confirm Samuel's encounter, but also perhaps to offer Flo some solace, some comfort in knowing that her husband might still be present, in some form. As I approached the apartment complex, I saw Flo outside, walking her dogs. Fate, it seemed, was on my side. I approached her, asking if she had a few minutes to speak privately about something important. Confused, but gracious, she invited me up to her apartment. We sat on her couch and I began cautiously, explaining that I wasn't there to cause her any distress, given the difficult year she had endured. She looked at me, her expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "I'll just get straight to it," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I think my son saw your husband in my apartment." I recounted the events of the previous night, explaining my reasoning. Her husband of 27 years was gone, and she felt adrift. Knowing that he might still be present, watching over her, eased some of that crushing loneliness. After we had both composed ourselves, I told her that if she ever wanted to visit the apartment, to perhaps speak to him alone, she should simply let me know. She promised she would, and I assured her I would hold her to that promise. She then offered a possible explanation for the incident. She suggested that Samuel might have reached into the drawer where we kept our steak knives, and that Johnny, in a protective gesture, had closed the drawer on his fingers, preventing him from accessing the sharp objects. Whatever the reason, I know that nothing unusual ever occurred in that apartment again, prior to that night. I believe that when Elijah was sharing those paranormal stories, Johnny might have sensed an opportune moment to communicate. I told Flo it was time I should leave. I offered her to come with me to try to communicate with him. She declined, needing time to let everything soak. I understood. I told her again to not ever hesitate to ask. She said she would not. I held her hand. I then headed back to my apartment with my son. I walk in, my apartment door wide open, as I had left it. I put my keys down. I said, "Hey Johnny, the scared guy is back. The one who ran out of here last night because he's too scared of ghosts. I am here to tell you that your wife, Flo, is 3 doors that way, and she will love for you to be there and be with her. Thank you for protecting my son. Please don't try to talk to me again, though, 'cause I can't handle it." I huged her as I left. After that night, nothing ever felt creepy or off. Within that home, my child never saw him again, and Flo never approached me to communicate with him. 7 months later, we moved out. I walked up to Flo's door, hugged her goodbye, and handed her the keys, telling her that if Johnny wanted to visit, the apartment was all hers until new tenants arrived. She took the keys, tears welling in her eyes, and we said our final goodbyes. I don't know if she ever returned to that apartment to speak to him, but I do know that Samuel's encounter, his unwavering identification of Johnny in that photograph, must have brought Flo a measure of comfort, a sense that she wasn't entirely alone, that her husband, in some way, remained with her. And that thought, that glimmer of hope amidst the grief and uncertainty, continues to bring a smile to my face whenever I reflect on the incident that transformed me from a skeptic into a believer in the paranormal. The Whisperer of Red Lick Road. This story, a chilling memory from my childhood, centers around a bizarre and unsettling series of events that plagued my younger sister, Amelia, when she was around 9 or 10 years old. I was a bit older, probably 12 or 13, and at the time we lived in a bungalow-style house in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood. Amelia's bedroom was located on the first floor, facing the driveway, while mine occupied the entirety of the upstairs space. One night, in the dead of sleep, Amelia woke me, her voice trembling with fear. She claimed that someone was outside her window, whispering to her. It was the middle of summer, and central air conditioning was a luxury we didn't possess. Bathed in the pale glow of a nearby streetlight, the gentle hum of its electrical workings the only sound. I dismissed her claims, attributing them to a vivid dream. "You were probably dreaming." I asked if they had said anything else. She shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "Just piece me free," over and over, in a child's voice. Now, I was genuinely scared. I almost woke Theodore, but I hesitated, deciding to inform him in the morning instead. The following morning, I relayed the events to Theodore. He, ever the pragmatist, dismissed it as a child's overactive imagination. I couldn't make out any features, but the size was unmistakable. It was the silhouette of a child. I immediately ran to my parents' bedroom, pounding on the door, waking Theodore. I breathlessly explained that Amelia had heard the kid again, and that I had seen someone running towards the back of the house. Theodore, instantly alert, leaped out of bed, throwing on his robe. The deliberate targeting of a child was profoundly unsettling. We never heard from her again. The mystery of her chosen phrases, her motivations, remains unsolved. But the memory of that night, the fear, the uncertainty, the chilling realization that a seemingly harmless old woman could harbor such malice, continues to haunt me to this day.